Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs here in Albany, New York for a conversation with New York State Historian Devin Lander. Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm thrilled to be joined today by New York State Historian Devin Lander. Devin, along with being the state historian, is also one-third of the editorial troika of New York history and is also the host of the two-time Edward R. Murrow Award-winning podcast, A New York Minute in History. And I am thrilled to have my colleague and friend Devin joining me for our first in-person interview, so you get to be here as I enter the realm of vlogging, a word the existence of which I was not aware until earlier this week. So, first of all, welcome, Devin.
Well, thank you, and welcome to the State Museum. It's great to be in person, and I'm very excited to talk to you about my job as state historian.
Well, it's great to have you, and it's great to be back in Albany for the first time in nearly 3 years. And I think a nice place to start, actually, would be if you could talk to us about the history of the state historian, because it's a sort of fascinating tale.
It really is. I think it's evidence of a long-standing interest and investment that the state of New York has had in its history, which actually goes back to the 1830s with the state legislature appropriating funding for the compilation of colonial records of the state of New York, in which they sent an agent, essentially an author, to Europe to collect material from the British, also the Dutch. And that was really among the earliest kind of public investments in history and the compilation of history. And from then, the state continued to kind of lead the way with the first state historic site, Washington's headquarters, which was also a site that was purchased with state funding, and that was the first in the nation. And then by 1895, there was the creation of the state historian position. Again, the first in the nation. At the time, there were no other state historians. There are many now. And I think the position was really created to continue to compile and edit and publish the history of the state of New York. And that has evolved over time. The first few state historians were not professionally trained historians, which makes sense because it's the late 19th century, and although there certainly were history programs in this country and PhD programs, it was still relatively a new field. But it was really in 1916 with James Sullivan being hired, who was my favorite state historian for a variety of reasons. uh, he was the first quote-unquote professional historian. He had a PhD from Harvard, actually, in history, and he really had a expansive vision for the position of state historian, and also the endeavor of history. And I don't know how much you want to go into his story, but I'll keep it short. He was the driving force behind the creation of the 1919 Local Government Historians Act, which was signed by L. Smith. And again, evidence of New York's investment in history. It was first of its kind in the nation, and what it did was allow for each municipality, at the time initially it was towns and villages, eventually included, was expanded to include counties and the 5 boroughs, to have a historian as the municipal historian. So really a public historian position. Again, first of its kind. And Sullivan did this because we have to think about the era in which he was operating. Of course, World War I had happened and was happening, and he took a role actually took a leave of absence from his position as state historian to help coordinate an educational initiative on the front to educate soldiers. They realized that many of the soldiers who were being brought up for World War I were poorly educated, and so there was an initiative underway, an organization called the American University in Europe, which was made up of university leaders in this country, also the Commissioner of the State Education Department, and then James Sullivan, to try to provide education for the troops, actually during wartime, which is pretty interesting. And they, by the time they were kind of up and running, and Sullivan's role was to find teachers that were willing to go to Europe and do this, and resources like books and other material. And they were, by the time they were really up and running, the war had ended, but it was they still played a very important role, because we had this massive force still in Europe who were, not doing a lot. So it was a real great opportunity to kind of focus the troops that were still in Europe on education, and so they were successful in implementing several programs. But what Sullivan saw when he was in France and other parts of Europe, England, was the reality that World War I was a massive historical event. And he saw it firsthand, and he realized that the United States, and specifically New York, where he was state historian, was behind other nations of Europe in collecting and preserving their history. So when he got back, and when he, kind of took his role back as state historian, he realized that to do World War I justice and to have the state be able to preserve the records related to the war and those who took part in the war, he needed a matrix of historians around the state. He couldn't do it himself. He couldn't do it even with a staff. He had a significant staff at the time, because you have to remember the state historian at that time also oversaw the state archives, which was not a separate agency, sub-agency at that time. So the state historian oversaw the state archives and records management for the state government. But he realized that we really needed historians in the municipalities who could collect the material from their own municipality and those who took part in the war. And that is one reason, and that's the main reason, that the Local Government Historians Law was enacted. But it's also one of the main reasons that New York State has such an extensive World War I collection. We have one of the most, I would say, complete collections in the state, or in the nation, in our state. So, and that's James Sullivan. So he was a big thinking state historian. He was a professional historian. He himself was published and did work. And but yeah, so the role has evolved over time. It was initially a governor's appointment until 1911, when the state education department kind of took it over. And again, the state historian was the records manager for the state, and essentially the state archivist as well. And also I should note, in the 1940s, the state historic sites were transferred from what at the time was the Environmental Conservation Department, which oversaw state parks and state historic sites, because they were not a separate agency at that point. So they transferred management of the state historic sites and the Bureau of Historic Sites to the state education department and the state historian. So the state historian oversaw those sites for several years until the 1960s, when Governor Rockefeller decided to rearrange things, and he created a thing called the New York Heritage Trust, which was a sub-agency of state parks, which became its own agency in 1972. But so it's as with all things in New York, it's kind of a convoluted story. But over time, the state historian has managed the state historic sites. He's managed the state archives, and then when those agencies and those pieces of the puzzle kind of became separate from the state historian became more of a museum-focused employee, and that's kind of how it was from the late 1970s until today. And I should note, though, that the other big thing that the state historian did in the late 1960s was oversee the planning and implementation of the bicentennial.
Oh.
So the bicentennial was run out of the Office of State History, and the state historian was the main kind of force behind that. And we're seeing that kind of come full circle today, as I'm not the sole driving force behind the 250th, but I'm certainly heavily involved along with my colleagues at state parks and state historic sites. So it's kind of an interesting a circle that's come back around. I should also note, going back to James Sullivan, as you noted, Rob, we are graciously able to be the co-editors with Jennifer Lemack and Aaron Noble of New York History Journal. James Sullivan was actually one of the driving forces and one of the initial editors of the New York Historical Society's journal when it became a separate journal. Before, I believe it was I'm going to say the wrong date, but before the 1930s, it was essentially the proceedings of the New York Historical Society. So it was papers given at their annual meeting, and James Sullivan was one of the driving forces behind making it an actual published journal that would come out 4 times a year at the time, quarterly, and be available for anyone to subscribe to. You didn't necessarily even have to be a member of the Historical Association, and you could get a subscription. So again, in 2018, when the New York Historical Association decided it didn't want to continue with the New York History Journal, and we were able to partner with Cornell University Press to kind of continue it. It was, again, a circle kind of coming around again, where the state historian was once again involved in editing the journal. So there's been a lot of that where I keep rubbing shoulders, so to speak, with James Sullivan, and that's why I consider him to be, one of the more expansive thinking state historians that we've had.
Oh, well, absolutely. How long was he in the position?
He actually was in the position from 1916 until, I think it was at least 10 years. I don't know the exact date. But what he ended up doing, he did not leave the agency. He transferred from being state historian to being a deputy commissioner in the state education department. So he continued to be involved even after he kind of left the title. And you see so many of his plans and ideas, again, kind of taking shape even after he moved on into other duties. But he's just a really interesting person, and I think Albert Corey. There were many great state historians who had great insight and great foresight, really, to be able to expand the position and work on various projects. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that actually it was James Sullivan in his position outside of being state historian when he was a deputy commissioner for education, the state education department, who worked very intently on helping to establish the state education department's historical marker program.
Oh.
So the blue and gold markers that we see, the metal ones that we still see in New York State, again, can trace their lineage back to James Sullivan and other state historians. And that was a result, interestingly, of the 150th anniversary of the American Revolution. The state created a commission at the time. Sadly, Al Smith vetoed the legislation that would create it, but his reason was that it really should be a program of the state education department and the state historian, and he was right. So he kind of said, rather than create this new governor and legislative commission, let's have the regents do it. And that actually ended up working pretty well, I think, because again, the state historian and the Office of State History was able to kind of take the lead on that. They were able to partner with other parts of the education agency and other agencies to do things like the marker program, to acquire land surrounding Saratoga Battlefield to kind of expand the battlefield, and Lake George and other sites around the state as well. And so that was a very successful commemoration. It was much different than what we would do today. Of course, it was not inclusive, I would say, and certainly was problematic in some of its celebratory or over-celebratory way of portraying the revolution. But they did have great success in putting on pageants and kind of commemorative events around the state that attracted, like for example, the one in Saratoga in 1927 attracted over 100,000 people. So I mean, just massive gatherings, and they would put on pageants, that were actually, as you know, the kind of pageant movement during the era, or they would be these acted out and very dramatic renderings of the revolution and the events at Saratoga. So, but that was again very successful. Lots of interest, lots of attendance, lots of press. We have in the state archives upstairs here extensive files from that era that show just the reach that the commemoration had around the state, and so in a way, Al Smith was right.
Well, it's interesting. Just parenthetically, it's very easy to misread Al with some of it, because you could read it superficially as very parsimonious. A lot of the things he does, when in reality, he wants to do things even bigger and better, but he wants them to be efficient. Because that's at the moment he's reorganizing state government, trying to streamline.
That's exactly was his reason for doing it that way,
Yeah,
and saying we already have an agency that can do this.
Right.
Let's let them do it. But he did support it. I mean, there was budgetary appropriations. There were he attended events, and he invited his fellow governors and other dignitaries from around the world, including the British and the French, the French and the Germans to attend, events. So, yeah, I think it was more about his realigning state government than it was any kind of negative. If you read his veto memo, it's not negative at all.
Right. One of the many areas where you sort of find yourself in the legacies of Sullivan is your ongoing interaction with all of these local and municipal town historians and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how that, you mentioned a little bit, now we've got county level and stuff, but how has that grown over the years, and what is your, now, today, what is your role like in sort of coordinating with them, engaging with them, and keeping that vision alive, really?
Yeah, it has changed, and it's it's really an interesting relationship. So, the state historian position is actually in statute, as is the local government historians, as I noted in past into law in 1919. And what it says in the statute is that the local government historians report to the state historian, which is an interesting process. So they do annual reports, not everyone, but I do get several hundred a year, and they inform me of the work they're doing. But really, my direct kind of work with the local historians is through their membership organizations. There are two in the state of New York. There's the Association of Public Historians of New York State, which we call AFNIS, and there's the Government Appointed Historians of Western New York, which we call GWANI. And they are separate organizations, which is kind of its own story, but they also have a lot of crossover. And I attend both of their conferences, and I work very closely, especially with AFNIS, with their board, and coming up with initiatives and helping them with the conference, helping them with directives that come from the Office of State History, kind of best practices. Mostly we have a document that we have made public for local government, for especially new local government historians, the kind of the duties and functions. This is what we see as your job, essentially. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that these historians are coming from many different areas and many different realities. Many of our smaller towns and villages, the position is unpaid. These are purely volunteer, and they bring a wealth of knowledge and understanding of their municipality, but we can't expect them to put in 40 hours a week and produce the amount of material or programs or education opportunities that we would expect out of a full-time person. So we have to always acknowledge that reality, and we do, and I have worked through organizations such as the Conference of Mayors and the Association of Counties about trying to get municipalities to support the position more robustly, because we do have such a range. Again, we have all volunteers, we have some who have a small stipend, we have others who are full-time. Mostly the county historians tend to be at that level where they're full-time county employees with an office, and some of them oversee historical collections for the county, mostly records. So it's a wide range. We have PhDs who are in these positions, and we have master's degree public historians who are in these positions, and we have completely untrained historians who again bring a wealth of knowledge and different abilities to the table. So it's a wide range, and my job, I look at it as to try to give suggestions and best practices, and work with AFNIS and work with GWANI on producing their conferences, which do a lot of education and kind of how to do things, that are usually put on by other historians. For example, Lauren Roberts, who's the Saratoga County historian and also my co-host of A New York Minute in History, has presented at the conferences, AFNIS conferences in the past, on a film that she helped produce as county historian, and kind of walked people through, how did we do this? Well, this is how we did it. And Joanna Yon from Orange County has done great presentations on how to do social media, how to do how to promote your work, how to promote your events. Sometimes it's very basic, and sometimes it's very complex, but this is the kind of, and I give a State of New York history address at every AFNIS conference, so I have a kind of a platform, and I attend, and I'm there the whole time. I'm usually taking part in at least one or two other panels. This year we're doing a live recording, so you're doing your first live recording. We're doing a live recording of the podcast, which we've not done before. So we're actually going to be recording at the AFNIS conference in Kingston, and we're going to be interviewing some of the other historians about their work and what they do as municipal historians. And so that's my my direct contact. And of course I get asked questions all the time from local historians. They kind of know to come to me, because although I'm most likely not going to know the answer, I can at least put them in touch with somebody, perhaps in the archives or in the library special collections. A lot of it is records related, like where do I find this information? And so I send them to Jim Foltz, and
That's usually the right
that's
answer.
the right answer. So, but I do get a lot of outreach, kind of on a weekly basis from local historians as well. So. It's a unique kind of relationship. I don't know that other states have anything like this. I believe the state of Connecticut in 1987 basically copied our 1919 legislation and created its own local government historians. But I'm not sure that how robust that is or anything.
Well, when I've heard you talk about this in the past, I always was sort of flabbergasted at the thought of this sort of overwhelming spectacle of trying to coordinate literally hundreds of. I thought that must be incredibly unruly, and it sounds like your way of managing that, your very sensible and sounds like successful way, is on the one hand to be sensitive to the very diverse needs of different communities, and also to be sort of supportive of helping them try to get the resources, try to get the institutional support that would enable them to do what they need to do, but do it better. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
No, absolutely, and that's true, and that's something I learned quite quickly when I became state historian in 2016, was how diverse the local historians were, and how diverse their kind of support level is from their own municipality. As I said, there's many are pure volunteers and do it out of love and out of care for their municipal history and for their community. Some don't even have their own office, and they're kind of just doing it from their home. Or others have an office. So it's so incredibly diverse in that way that I realized that there is no one size fits all. There is no way to for us to tell municipalities this is what your historian should be doing. We can give suggestions and the duties and functions and all of that, which we do, but at the end of the day, they're responsible to their elected leaders. They're appointed by in the case of a town, it'd be the town supervisor, mayor, town board, county legislature. So they're appointed positions, and we have to be cognizant of that reality too. That is, at the end of the day, they have to make sure that their immediate supervisors are happy with the work they're doing. So, and there's a rich variety of work out there that's happening, and again, that's a range. Some of our local historians do wonderful public programs, education programs with schools. Some do publishing, where they write articles for newspapers or magazines. Some have weekly, I don't know how they do it, but they have weekly columns that are weekly. Many of our historians in their local papers have a very robust presence in a column or this day in history type of thing. And so it does range. And like I said, others manage county collections and do a variety of work in that regard. So and I think working through the membership organizations that represent them is the way that a kind of centralized government person like myself can actually work with them. Otherwise, it would be nearly impossible.
Well, I was actually going to ask briefly. I mean, it sounds like, if you don't mind my bringing this up, and if you do, I can edit it, but it sounds like your background as someone, I mean, you're trained in history, and then you spent a lot of time working, people can't see it, but out the window we can see the beautiful New York State Capitol building, working across the mall there. It sounds like your political background might actually be useful in all of this.
Yeah, well, it certainly was, and it is, continues to be. And I think when I was being considered for this position, that was actually a big attraction. Of course, you'll have to ask Jennifer this more closely and Mark, but they made the final decision. But I know that in conversations we've had since, that yes, having that political understanding of how New York State works, but also I should say I was the Museum Association of New York director most immediately before being state historian, so I also had a knowledge of museums and an understanding of the field in that regard, because Museum Association is another membership organization that represents museums of all types and sizes, not just history, around the state. So we had members such as the MAT and the Museum of Natural History and the real big internationally significant institutions, all the way down to small volunteer-run historical societies. And so that gave me an oversight and an overview, I should say, of that important and vital field in New York State. But yeah, the political background gives me an understanding of the agencies and how things work in Albany. I say that was my most important kind of postgraduate work that I've done, and that was the most eye-opening and educational in many ways, having gone from being a project archivist at SUNY Albany and working, also at People's Island for state parks and doing, pure history stuff, pure public history stuff and archival stuff, and then being kind of thrown into thrown to the wolves in the assembly was very eye-opening and interesting, but a wonderful education and a wonderful way to understand how history is perceived by our political leaders, right. How it's and that can be good or bad, but I got to see where things that I cared about, history, museums, things like that, where they kind of aligned in the big picture of the state apparatus and the state government. And so yeah, it was fantastic, and it's allows me to be, I think, sympathetic to our appointed historians who I reported to an elected official. I was employed by an elected official, so I understand that kind of dynamic, and how that can be good or bad, and can be constricting in some cases or not. Depends on the person, but so yeah, I think it does kind of give me that.
I don't think I knew you had been working at People's Island. I love that place.
I started as an intern there, and then I worked as a consultant. I was actually paid to work on historic. Well, actually, they were interpretive signs. They weren't all historic, which was really eye-opening and interesting to me. So our job was anytime a state park needed an interpretive sign for something, they would come to us, and many that I worked on, I would say most were history related, but there were a few that were kind of like nature and science related that were really interesting, that I got to go outside my comfort level and learn about things like the Seiche phenomenon on the Great Lakes, and which is kind of a tidal wave type thing that occurs in our Great Lakes.